Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive, neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's session is Reclaiming the Gita, an investigation of the epic in the modern world. Today, we have with us author and associate professor of communication, Santa Clara University, Rohit Chopra, who is in conversation with writer and journalist Salil Tripathi on the significance and role of the Gita, religion, and tradition in the contemporary world. Examining the challenges posed by the present-day global order, including political instability, the rise of authoritarianism, the epidemic of fake news, and subversion of democracy through the weaponization of social media, the backlash against the rights of caste, ethnic, or racial minorities, and climate change. The dialogue will address what the Gita may offer in helping us respond to such demands and where it may fall silent. The discussion will also speak to the urgent need for evaluating the Gita on the basis of a framework of public reason rather than of religious authority. The full bios of the speakers will appear in your chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the session, please feel free to use the Q&A box to pose any questions, share observations or comments with the speakers, and they will address them towards the end of the session. With that, I hand it over to Salil.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone in India, and very early good morning to you, Rohit, and some of your friends who I see are in the participants from the West Coast, and good afternoon to those somewhere in the middle in Europe. Actions have consequences, and actions are to be taken in an environment of uncertainty. I'm not a student of philosophy or religion or law for that matter, but I did study economics. And John Kenneth Galbraith wrote this famous book called The Age of Uncertainty. From the cricket captain who decides to bat or field, the farmer who decides to sow wheat or corn, the investor picking between natural gas or renewables, the IIT graduate who has to choose between joining an IT firm or getting an MBA and join Goldman Sachs later, and the mother who decides to eat one chapati less to give one more chapati to her daughter. We all face decisions which have moral reasoning behind it and factors behind it. These decisions are made in the face of uncertainty, and each of these decisions has a consequence. A steel plant closes in America. What has caused it are factors ranging from an exchange rate manipulation, labor costs, corporate debt, investor greed, more industrious workers in a distant plant in China, pollution control measures at home. The worker has a sense of powerlessness. He must do his duty, but rewards are beyond his efforts. He cannot control the consequences. There is agency, but it exists only in name. And it accentuates our differences. The worker who has lost the job finds it easier to blame it on an outsider. It's a Mexican immigrant in America, or the settler in Assam who has come in from the plains, the family who eats meat or worships a different god and has come in the neighborhood, or veers towards a charismatic leader who assuages pain and reminding you that even if you're the majority, it's not your fault, really. He will make you feel powerful again. Think of Slobodan Milosevic, Benjamin Netanyahu, Recep Erdogan, Rodrigo Duterte, Bolsonaro, and indeed Narendra Modi. That leads to a sense of permanent rivalries, us and them, ours and theirs, we and the others. This otherization colors our thinking, dividing us between red states and blue states in America, between those who believe in saffron and the tricolor in India, and the vaccinated and unvaccinated in many parts of the world. This is a grim landscape, and there is need for a way forward. Is that way forward coming through religion, through ethics, through philosophy? Is there a singular way? Can it be found in one book? And is that one book the Bible, the Quran, the Ramayana? Or as Rohit attempts to answer in this new book, is it the Gita? And if so, how? And what are the limitations? And how do we read Gita? What kind of book is it, Rohit? Is it the book that everyone who has lived through the Indian experience thinks has read it without actually having read it. I think you quote Ramanujan or Amit Chaudhary further up in the book saying something similar. So is it a religious text? Are we trying to find a way out of this confusing mess which you present in a, polymath manner? Because, you quote Heidegger on one hand and journalists on the other, and you quote politicians and even, ancient philosophers. So is it a religious text?
All right, wonderful question. First of all, I want to thank BIC. I just want to thank Salil. I think this is the third long conversation I've had the privilege of having with him in recent times, but I've known him for 20 years, and I want to thank Westland. And again, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful framing of the question. So my question, my sort of quick answer is that, academics love to say yes and no, but I don't like that because it means nothing. Yes, it is a religious text. I think we have to recognize it as a religious text. Now, the question is, given that fact, what do we do with it? So I'm going to just start by a couple of quick points. One is that I certainly don't think that the Gita or any text should be the only text that should determine our response to any situation, whether it's an ethical situation. So, if we want to think of it as, or any text as like the Bible, I tend not to think that there are Bibles of one thing or another, right? That I don't think that you can pick up Jordan Peterson's 12 rules and it will help you lead life, or Deepak Chopra for that matter, or even, the Gita or Shakespeare, for instance. Each of these books has something to contribute. Now, for the Gita, a text like the Gita, and we can think of similar religious texts in other traditions, this is a conundrum. I was actually reading the Caravan, and I know you and I have both written for the Caravan, a very interesting article about how Narendra Modi has actually used the Gita to justify many of his actions, which we know have had, less than savory political consequences. And then it's a really, really good and interesting essay. And I was thinking how this could actually serve as a critique of the kind of point I'm trying to make. So I think what I am suggesting, and I know it may even seem like a utopian possibility, is that we should draw on a text like the Gita. We should engage with it critically. But given that, and I know that it comes with this baggage almost, which I'll talk about a little more, but given that, the way in which we judge it, the basis on which we judge its arguments, cannot be, ye Bhagwan ki marzi hai, this is the final word of God. Because if you do that, then opposing it becomes an act of heresy or blasphemy. And then you get into this territory of who owns religion. Now, even if we were to look at it as a religious text, in an ideal situation, or, America is less than ideal in many ways, but perhaps you can freely criticize religion more than you can in the Indian context. So, in an ideal world, I would say even religious texts as such, we should be free to criticize them. In the Indian context, for instance, where this would have a different kind of purchase than it would in the American context, I think you have to essentially make it accessible to everyone, open it out to critique, right? Understand its role, contextualize its role, but not see it as the voice of divine authority. Now, is such a project possible at all? My answer to that is that whether you like it or not, texts like the Gita, given their history, are already part of our thinking. For a lot of people, people turn to them, and people turn to them as the word of God, or they look at it critically and so on. So there is one line of thinking which says that, look, just let's not keep texts like this at all, right? We want texts that are absolutely secular. It only has to be the Constitution of India. And I would say that the values that the Constitution embodies, or the values of secularism, human rights, those have to be paramount. Where the Gita falls short, those values are going to be our touchstone. But the fact of the matter remains that whether it's the Gita, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Bible, people are drawing on these and on other sources, right? So if I were to go down the philosophical lane a little bit and the academic lane a little bit, the question becomes that, can you have a world of public debate which is purely secular even in its sources, right? That can secularism have a positive content of its own? Or even if it comes to enshrining, following the value of secularism, do people draw on many sources, including spiritual and religious sources? So that's my sort of general question. Do the realities of India warrant that we attempt something like this, or is it too dangerous a proposition? Now, that might be something I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about as well.
Yeah, sure. No, two or three ideas came to me as you were speaking. One was an old quote that, Dr. Chagla, MC Chagla, who was, distinguished diplomat and a cabinet minister in the Nehru years. And he wrote this beautiful autobiography called Roses in December. And, when the emergency was lifted, he was quite a vocal critic of the emergency as well. And Dr. Chagla had once said, and this is at the heart of what we are getting into as we go forward, that India has allowed religion to degenerate into religiosity. And I think and the whole emphasis on ritual as against the ideas and the spiritual ideas. And the other thing that occurred to me, when you were talking about US and India and being able to challenge religious argument, is what the late Christopher Hitchens used to say, that, religion is an idea which can be criticized, but insulting the religious is stupid because, they are people and, they believe in something, and you may choose to engage or not engage with them, but it does not mean that you cannot challenge the idea. And I think that's a very good way of framing the whole idea about, are you against Islam or Islamophobia or against Muslims? Because each of these things is a different thing, just as are you against Hindutva, Hinduism, or Hindus? And, challenging Hindutva is a political act. Challenging Hinduism can be a philosophical argument. But, ridiculing Hindus is a silly idea in a way, because, it takes. So I think that distinction is worth bearing in mind. Now, you spoke about constitution and its paramountcy, and that's what brings me to another of my favorite writers, Salman Rushdie, who always talks about faith, doubt versus reason, because constitution is a rational product created by people through thinking and ideas, and is most constitutions, most liberal constitutions tend to, may draw on religious ideas, but are not religious documents. Lawyers may treat them as, as if they're Delphico, but we all know constitutions are amended, and some constitutions are amended too often, some too little, and some too often. So there is an element of reason there. And a book like Gita, however, is based on faith. So when you make a rational argument about equality and you do that in the book, about talking about Dalits and women and how Gita is silent on many of these aspects. And Ambedkar dislikes many aspects of Gita for that reason. So if that is the context in which we are, when we talk about the constitution, the devout will produce a book and say, but no, this is the divine word. How is it possible to have the dialogue? It's wonderful you've written this book. For those who care about Hinduism and those who care about philosophy, it will be a great tract. But others will simply say, here's this leftist academic from the left coast of America telling us what to think.
Well, thank you, Sully. That's an absolutely marvelous question. And I'll say that that's one response. And the other response is that, I am apparently also a soft Sanghi now, because there has been a strand of left thinking in India, and I think globally as well, which says that you just do not touch anything that has anything to do with religion, right? But I think that by doing that in the Indian context and other contexts as well, you actually cede ground. You cede ground to the right. Now look, the question is, for every kind of book, there are all kinds of readers. And what I'm going to say will sound a little facile, but it isn't, right? You also have those devoted Star Wars fans, right? Who will watch all 9 films, and they will absolutely refuse to hear any criticism of any film, and even online, right? You say something about a band on YouTube, and the next thing you know is people are basically saying nasty things about your mother and your father. So that is also a form of reading, right? Now, of course, what is at stake? It's sometimes people will say nasty things, but you won't have a vigilante mob turning up at your house, or you won't have people on social media baying for your blood. So the question is, you have these readerships, right? I would actually say that, even if it were understood purely as a religious text with everything that entails, it should still be open, as Rushdie said, as Hitchens said, right? And I know you and I agree on this, it should still be open to criticism, right? And even offensive criticism, barring a sort of very high line of hate speech, which is not exclusive to religion. So I think we should not treat religion with kid gloves. Now, again, this in the Indian context, this may seem like, an impossible ask, that how do you ensure that people from, different caste, religious backgrounds or gender can criticize this text without getting this pushback? But I think, we need to start doing it. And I'm fully aware that I'm I'm saying this personally, sitting, on the West Coast of America with a great deal of privilege. And I do not claim to know what the situation is like on the ground. I'm not unsympathetic with a school principal who, may actually have to, or a college principal who may actually have to cancel a talk with a speaker if he knows that, some group of right-wing thugs is going to turn up there. But the question is, the point I want to make is that we have arrived here precisely because of that idea that we've taken. Now, coming to the Gita itself, every text, most texts, barring propaganda, have, what media studies scholars call polysemy. I mean, there is a richness to them, right? And there is no one necessarily authoritative or final reading. And I think we have to, it's a paradox in a sense. We have to say that as the voice of divinity in your private life, this text means everything to you, and one can respect that reading. But that cannot be admissible as a form of public reason. How do we weigh the different aspects of the Gita? Every text has its contradictions, and again, also depends on the perspective that you're looking at it from. From our modern day perspective, this is a text that does have contradictions. And in fact, Amit Chaudhary, the Folio Society in America produces these beautiful editions. Several years ago, the Folio Society did a magnificent edition of the Gita, and Amit Chaudhary wrote the introduction. And I had a bit of a conversation with Amit, and he was kind to, it's the book's out of print, he sent me his introduction. He says the Gita is a book that is at war with itself.
Tell me more. Why?
Well, precisely because of some of the kinds of arguments that I made, and I hadn't unfortunately read Amit's argument. I read an article he wrote. He said, because you have these imperatives that contradict each other, right? He says, one thing he says is, you look at this Krishna of the Gita, everywhere else, right, in all the discourse about Krishna, he's playful, laughing, right? The Krishna of the Gita is the only real sort of time you see this Krishna who's, claiming this. And what he says is, one way to basically read it is that this text within the religious and philosophical tradition is, it's an attempt perhaps to combat the influence of certain other schools of thought and thinking, right? And so there is a kind of theological debate at work out here. There's another argument about its tensions, which is made by Romila Thapar, not by Amit, but using the metaphor of war. That what Romila Thapar points out is that this is a text that is on the cusp of a society that's transitioning from a clan society, Kul, to a caste society. So the world of the Mahabharata, right, in whatever part of Northwest India it was set in, the stories told here are stories of very powerful families. And what's happening is that your obligation to your kin, your family members, is paramount. But then once this starts transitioning the norms to a sort of caste-based society, or these families get more powerful and so on, as a king, you have to uphold the norms of caste. So that's one way of actually understanding where Krishna is coming from.
And it's not just a king. It's not just a king. It's even those around the king, which is why it's a teacher who ends up telling Ekalavya to, chop off his. Yeah,
absolutely.
So there are enablers in the system. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's related to a question of power. Now, my point is that yes, it's a religious text, and there are religious frameworks, and within religious frameworks, there are more critical readings, and there are less critical readings. So it's not like all religious readers are unsophisticated. So you have religious readings, but it's also philosophical text. It's also historical text. It's also a cultural text. So I'm saying that let's level the playing field, right? And barring a very, very high bar, where, as you said, people are sort of mocking Hindus or, in public discourse or whatever. And again, I'm not saying that even if people do that, you should invoke section 153 or 295. The extreme interpretations will fall by the wayside. But let's have a range of interpretations, right? And we might well say that, look, just given the complicated history of the Gita, maybe we have to be ultra cautious with it. But I think it should be done. It can be done. Now, one last point I'll make, I know I've been going on and we want to make this conversation, is I'm not saying set aside the aspects of the Gita that are not consistent with gender rights or caste rights. We have to keep that in the foreground as well. I think it's important to do that. So I'm not saying that the universalism supersedes it, but but on the other hand, I would say that the text is not exhausted by those aspects, right? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, and I think the point you make about this discourse is also very important from a free spirit, because the book has survived like at least a millennium, if not more. And if it has survived, it can certainly survive a cartoon or some criticism or even some vituperative dislike, a message full of dislike that might come from someone. And I think people who want to become warriors defending any book for that matter, it's not just about Gita, have to think themselves, is a book stronger them or they are there to protect the book. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind. But I want to go back, just one more question about Gita itself before we widen it to, and I can see questions are coming thick and fast, but please hold on to those. I will be looking at them later and we will come to them at the right time. And I don't want to put this in a binary mode, this discussion, but is Gita really about action or inaction? Is it telling us that, you to do your duty, what happens, it's not in your hand, and that keeps, India mired in the so-called Nehru rate of growth or Hindu rate of growth, whichever way you want to call it, of 2% growth, that, we tried our best, but it's beyond our hand, it's matter beyond. So do we have locus of control? And if so, to what extent? What is to be expected? What is expected of us? And things, if they don't turn out the way they do, where does the fault lie?
Okay. Oh, it's an absolutely wonderful question about accountability, right? And again, this is why I would essentially say that the frame in which, or the idea of public reason, and I don't want to get into like the academic weeds with John Rawls. Let me start by basically saying that I believe in any modern society or today that you absolutely need to have the foundation of rights, justice, and accountability, right? Justice and rights are at the end of the day about accountability, right? And that framework in many societies, to quote a teacher of mine, Abdullah Yanaim, is that, as a scholar of human rights, that framework is both absolutely necessary, but also radically insufficient, right? So you need to have like content coming from somewhere, the depth. Now, coming back to your question about really what's called Nishkama Karma Yoga, action without consequences, right? How does it essentially relate to the question of responsibility? Does it allow one to abdicate one's responsibility? And does it allow one to sort of not take responsibility for the consequences, really, of one's actions? And I think the answer to that is no, right? The way I think about it, I'm not saying that the Gita is the final word on everything, and I'm not doing that number which a lot of Uncle G's do about that. Vedas knew the cure for cancer, Vedas had the internet and all. But look at what Marx said about human agency. He said men, and he means humans, they make history, but they do not do it in circumstances of their own choosing, which means that we all act under certain constraints. Right? And then the actions that you wind up taking, the outcomes that they have may not be what you had intended. And I think that's where the value of the Gita comes in, because I think that paragraph, and I'm going to mention two very quick things about that para, that phrase, Nishkama Karma Yoga, it is nowhere in the Gita itself. Mm-hmm. I went on a detective hunt. I had friends who are Sanskritists, asked other Sanskritists. So it comes into, I think, common understanding, and it is one of the legitimate ways in which the Gita is understood. It's part and parcel of how we see the Gita now. So maybe it comes from Gandhi or Aurobindo. That's a different exercise. So the passage basically says that you are entitled to doing what is your action, right? That if you're, and this is maybe linked to like the dynamics of caste or whatever, if you should do something, right? You're entitled to the action that you have to take by virtue of whatever criteria, but you do not have a right over the fruits of that action, adhikara. And it's actually a fairly complex passage, I should mention that. Different people have interpreted it in different ways. But then it says it doesn't mean that inaction is the answer. And the Gita is very clear about this. Throughout the text beyond that, it keeps describing the man of inaction as the lowest of three kinds of men. And the first man is the man of equanimity. The second person is the person of passion, who still, it's sort of middle ground, but you're given to impulses. And the third person is the person of inaction. So I make a distinction between non-action and inaction. So this is not a question of inaction. Now, one of the ways in which I've tried to make this relevant, and again, how persuasive and successful that is up for debate, is to say that making a distinction between outcomes and consequences. You can't control outcomes. And that's what the failure of like centralized planning was. And I'm absolutely delighted that you brought in economics, because I'm not an economist by training, but it seemed to me there were some very interesting resonances in, ideas about, for instance, just, projects of like planning or Heikian ideas or ideas about regulation that come from, Gary Becker in the Chicago School, which was that the most well-intended regulation can produce all kinds of complicated effects, which is why you have the Office of the Regulatory Czar and in the US and Cass Sunstein. I mean, every possible regulation that might be introduced, let's say something to do with tech firms, they model a large number of scenarios to think of what the options would be. So I think of the Gita in terms of that, in those sorts of terms. And I make this conceptual distinction about an outcome being something that a guaranteed end you want to get to. But what you must do is you must contemplate what the different consequences are ethically, right? And this is where we can draw on a couple of other concepts that this could be your dharma. Now, sometimes the best action may be not to act. Sometimes you decide that I will just let everything go by. And we do this in our life all the time. You have a colleague who makes an unpleasant remark, right? Do you say something and you make a decision on the spot that you may not? So not doing something may actually be a form of action. Not acting can be a form of action, right? So this is the question for us. And so it expands these concepts for me. Now, have people used it to justify, all kinds of barbarisms? Of course. But which text has not? And secular texts have too, right? One of the best exhibitions I went to is it was at the Folger Library in Washington, DC. They have these original copies of the 16th and 17th texts for which people were actually burnt, put at the stake or executed. And it was called, I think, Dangerous Books. So books subvert power, but books can also be used in the service of power. Is there anything particular about the text of the Gita that lends itself to it? It's an interesting question. And that's why I start with the book, where Oppenheimer invoked the Gita, but so did Gandhi, right? So we can say that, yes, it's been used in, pre-independence and post-independence India to justify inaction, Hindu rate of growth, violence. But it also inspired Mahatma Gandhi, who led the world's largest mass nonviolent political movement.
Look, several very interesting ideas that came up. I've done some amount of work on complicity in human rights of non-state actors, particularly companies. And one of the questions often comes up is silence complicity. If you're operating in Xinjiang, in China right now, and with what's going on to Uyghur community, or if you're in Myanmar and with what's going on to Rohingya, by not speaking out, is that good enough or not? And there are debatable issues about it, because sometimes by speaking out, you can actually cause harm. So yes, there is a logic to that inaction. And the other part that I found very useful about, the belief in the regulation to do good is similar to how you end the book by talking about technology, where people think that it can always be the force for good. And whether it's artificial intelligence, contact tracing, the deep mind, whichever way we can look at it, they're obviously going to be pitfalls, that the unintended consequences are not seen properly. And I think so that's the kind of thinking that's helpful to know. But I wanted to, play a kind of a mind game of sorts here, that if inaction is sometimes justified, do you think it's possible that, when the disrobing of Draupadi begins, at that time, if the Pandavas rose and stopped it there and then, there would have been no Mahabharata and no Gita?
So should they have done it? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Right.
I mean, that's where our 20th century or 18th, whichever century thinking comes in, or any century's thinking comes in. I mean, this should not stand. That should have been the policy, yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at it as a historical text with a certain kind of distance, as a philological text, I mean, I've had conversations with philosophers, I've had conversations with Indologists, Sanskritists on the book. So if you look at it in its historical context as a text, you would, yes, I mean, the obviously, the question of gendered violence is really, really troubling. And there's a larger sort of philosophical question here and a methodological question here about how do we judge texts that are away from our time, right? How do we judge acts of violence, right? Is some violence that today we find horrific justified because it was contextually what everyone had to do around that time? Or do we just say that even by the standards of that time, that there is some universal understanding of violence as being bad, to use very simplistic language, and therefore, even in its own terms, this is a fundamentally unethical act. So that's one question, right? And historians will argue about it. But thinking of it as a text that can speak to this present moment of global crisis, absolutely. Now, yes, they should have acted, right? So, and this is why I say that that's one of the ways in which because you keep attributing this divine power to it, then you can justify just about anything. And I in retrospect, the way I framed not wanting to engage with religion could have been done better in the book, because I do talk about religious authority and reason a lot. But when I say I don't want to do a religious reading, it's precisely like not to justify everything. Now, would we have had the Mahabharata? Would we have had the Gita? This takes us in a different territory about what the provenance of the Gita itself is. And there's debate among scholars about whether it was introduced later or whether it's an organic part of the Mahabharata. And there are all kinds of interesting sort of shifts and changes here. And, Ramanujan, for instance, says that, nobody would imagine, the Mahabharata without the Gita, for instance, right? So I see it as, we can see it as a kind of double status. I know I'm going in a slightly different direction. You can read it as a standalone text to use contemporary language, or you can read it as a part of the Gita. But it's to your point, and I think there have been some very interesting retellings of the story of the episode involving Draupadi. Part of the chilling effect with the rise of the Hindu right over the last 20-30 years, and not just the Hindu community in India, but Muslims, Sikhs, this is, everyone calls for, you can't say anything about our text, you can't desecrate our text. Those kind of readings kind of stopped. So we should actually have more retellings which challenge that idea. Now, the interesting question would be, within that world, were there logics by which these actions could be criticized? And I think, yes, they could. So you could absolutely have a different kind of a feminist, or whatever term you want to call it, interpretation of the text.
The three I want to mention, we don't have to discuss the three interpretations, but three I've been struck by. One is, of course, Iravati Karve and Yuganta is one that immediately comes to my mind. The other is the brilliant Until the Lions by Karthika Nair, which is a retelling of the Mahabharata from the perspective of female characters. And the third is Kiran Nagarkar's play, Bedtime Story, where the monologue or soliloquy that Draupadi has when the disrobing takes place is chilling, absolutely chilling, about when she castigates Krishna for coming very late, that even you were becoming a warrior of sort and not coming. And I think it's a brilliant piece of writing by Kiran there. So you have these and now, of course, a God Song, this new set of poems that Amit Majumdar, the American author, has written. So that's also worth it. But I want to come back to another idea, which is the doubt of Arjuna and the certainties of leaders. And when I read that part in the book, what struck me was a debate between Gandhi and Bose at the time of the independence. Because when Subhash Bose decides, that he wants to take a particular path, and this, after the Congress where, he has decided to resign because Gandhi and his supporters were not going to support him as a Congress president, and he says that I think we need a more militant response. At that time, Gandhi has this letter, and I'm quoting from memory, so I'm not exactly quoting it right, and I don't have the text in front of me, but something to the effect of that, the ends that we wish to reach may seem to be same, but only appear to be the same. But they are not the same, the means matter. And I think that was a key difference between the choices that Bose ends up making, including allying with the Axis power, and Gandhi, who actually chooses to quit India movement, and in 1942. So it's something worth bearing in mind, because I know that you want to bring in the Gandhian reading. So this is the opportunity to talk about that. If you can tell why do you think Gandhi's reading matters?
Yeah, and again, this doesn't mean that Gandhi is above critique. For instance, Dalit intellectuals and scholars will essentially say that, for Ambedkar, the Gita was a counter-revolutionary text. So Gandhi's reverence for it, in fact, what you might say, only made it that much harder to criticize it. So, when we think of you think of Gandhi, I'm not necessarily a fan of the film Gandhi, and Salman Rushdie in Imaginary Homelands really takes the film to task. But even in that film, even in popular renditions, you do see Gandhi as a kind of reflective person. And you know that, meditation and thinking was an important part of who he was. And he was often very anguished, right? He didn't know that he was taking the right direction. There is a kind of leap of faith here. And I think in some ways he read Gandhi as, one of the translations I look at points out that he's not a literalist. He's not a close reader. He reads the text allegorically, even though he's arguably the most famous reader of the Gita. So Gandhi was also often, indecisive about things and had that. And what I say is that, we live in a moment, if you look at our popular discourse, if you look at the figures that we revere, it's always the person who seems to be of action in an obvious way, right? Visible action. Right? Or it's the person, like whether it's Narendra Modi, it's Vladimir Putin, you hear people who otherwise espouse values of democracy, rights, etc. They'll say that, but he's, and a lot of like Indians, we want like this idea of a strong state and a strong leader, right? That was part of Trump's appeal as well. Just rush into it. The person who instinctively knows what to do. And we fetishize this figure, whether it's the entrepreneur or whatever. But I'm saying that uncertainty, doubt, anguish, right? And what are also very important because they may lead you to a path of action that may let you see things in different ways. And I think part of that is understanding the limits of your own knowledge. So to me,
and speaking about the need for leader, actually, Bertolt Brecht has a very famous line in his play Galileo, where Andrea comes to Galileo and says that unhappy is a nation without heroes. And Galileo says, no, unhappy is a nation in need of heroes.
That's fantastic. Absolutely. And, I have to mention that this point that because we've known each other 20 years, we first were on a common like South Asian journalist discussion list. And I remember you making this point about Chori Chora and saying that for Gandhi, the lesson was the means matter as much as the ends. And to me, that is such a strong ethical principle. And, I think, am I necessarily forcibly reconciling ideas in the Gita to that? I don't necessarily think so. I think it is an interpretation that, like all interpretations, it can be critique. I'm just one other voice, but I think that the text gives us enough. Salil, I want to get back to this earlier question about, public reason and, the idea and the Indian model of secularism, which, as we know, was not about strict separation of religion and state. And I believe religion and state, again, following the work of my professor Abdullah Yannaim, should be conceptually distinguished from religion and politics. Religion and politics, how do you separate them, right? People make decisions based on their religious beliefs, and they're able to. Now, the Indian model was equal embrace of all religions or equal equidistance. How you do that in practice is a very complicated question. But to me, some of the most secular people I've seen are people who are also deeply religious. And I want to go to something that I remember you wrote an article in which you mentioned, talking to your mother about the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And she said, they have killed Gandhi. And to me, that was really very interesting because here is a debate which has been given which draws on the history of religious conflict. And that's not the only history between Hindus, Muslims, it was just a very powerful way of understanding it. And I don't know whether your mother was a religious person or not. But, to me, there is something about India, about the model of India that Gandhi embodied, and about this act. And I think, to me, that is a legitimate kind of reason, right? Gandhi stands for something. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that again, and what are your thoughts? Because you've written extensively on religion and rights. You wrote a book, Offense, the Hindu Case, right? So what are your thoughts about this?
So
how do we
I wish I knew how we reconcile it. I don't. In fact, I shy away and, stay away from the debate largely because it gets too contentious. And, in the sense that, routinely, because every time you criticize a particular religion, people immediately come back to say, but what about why? Every time I defend, say, Gauri Lankesh or, Siddiq Kapan or any of the journalists facing threat in India, Rana Ayub and Varavara Rao, the poet, and they say, but what about Pakistan? Where were you when Salman Rushdie's book was banned? I say, before there was Google, there were libraries. Why don't you go and read what is there about Salman Rushdie? So anyway, but or for that matter, Danish cartoons or Charlie Hebdo and all that. It's ad hominem and ad nauseum at the same time. So I kind of it almost bores me, that kind of a discussion. And I do think that having worked in the human rights sphere for about 20, 25 years, I do see limitations of approaching equality, fairness, justice, and ideas like that from one particular perspective of an ethical strand. I'll give an example. When I was a student at Dartmouth College many, many years ago, 100 years ago, or something like that. At that time, I ran the campus group of Amnesty International. And a very fine young woman who was a couple of years junior to me was also there. And she was a devout Catholic, and she hated torture, she hated death penalty. So she embraced amnesty as an ideal. And she insisted that I was doing what I did because I was a good Hindu. And I said, no, I'm doing what I'm doing because this is what my mother would be very happy about, that I'm doing something right to get somebody out of jail, writing a letter or two. I'd expressed some admiration for Dalai Lama once, and another friend, also an Irish Catholic, American Irish Catholic, gave me a book by Dalai Lama as a present. He said, I know that you are at heart a Buddhist. So, I'm not going to say no to such a nice book, so I took it, Kindness, Compassion, and Clarity. That was the book he gave me. So, of course, there is something that you can find in every religious book that is useful, just as there's something extremely useful in almost every great work of poetry, great work of art, great work of literature. Mahabharata and Ramayana are terrific examples of great literature. When my son, who studied at Cambridge, when he was doing English literature, among the texts he had to read was Bible as a form of literature and not as a form of religious text at all. And I think there is something to be said about, reading those things as for what they are, but not to see them as the one book that has all the answers. And I think that's why I go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which culls together and, brings ideas together from various strands and tries to come up with something in a non-denominational manner. So, do I believe? I don't know. I do believe in, cricket. So I do think that sometimes Gavaskar, when he bats, it's almost divine, Sometimes when Bhimsen Joshi sings, it's divine. I would never, but I don't want to make light of that. But the fact is that there are aspects of Kishore Amonkar's voice, Mallikarjun Mansoor's voice, all these things are almost, they're at an elemental level, which are very hard to put into words, almost spiritual significance. But is it because of some divine element there? I don't know. I don't even want to get there. So I'm very happy to, live with the idea of being a healthy agnostic is the way I approach this. And from that perspective, it becomes very easy to address the human rights argument. So, and again, if someone were to tell me that I do this because I'm a good Christian, if it gets contentious, I will say, but then what do you have to say about Catholics and the right to choose on abortion issues, about Catholicism and gay rights? What do you have to say about that? If someone were to say that I do it because I'm a good Muslim, yes, but then how do you explain what is being done in its name, whether it is jihadi violence or whether it's the treatment of women? And if someone says Hindus, I would again point out caste and all the other inequities that are in that faith. Buddhism has problems too. Look at what Viratu is doing in Myanmar for the Rohingyas, so there's no faith which can claim to be completely pure. That's a very long answer to your question. Yeah. But no, I do want to, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, please.
No, I want to go back to another work of yours, which I don't want to lose sight of, because in 7 or 8 minutes, we'll have to open it for questions. But before I do that, I do want to refer to Akshay Mukul's work on Gita Press and the politicization and weaponization of Hinduism that has happened. And he wrote this brilliant book on the Gita Press and what it did to a generation of thinking in India at that time. So not to dissect that book further, but that is very neatly tied in with, the spread of technology that you talk about in the book, and your other book, the Virtual Hindu Rashtra, which looks at saffron nationalism in the new media. So if you can just elaborate on that how is it that these elements which have weaponized the faith in a way are using the technology to, gain the upper hand?
Right. And, it's a very, very interesting question about, does media simply reflect elements that already exist in society, or does media actually shape them, right? And I think it's some of both, right? And, we can go back to like the Gutenberg Bible, right? We can go back to the printing press, which by various accounts, led to the rise of languages that were vernacular. It led to literacy. It led to mass education. It led to, in one theory, democratization, and another theory, nationalism, right? So we know that technology is, sort of immensely powerful in this way. Now, the question that you're asking, the really deep question, right, is that when you have these kind of technologies of mass communication, is there something in the negative message, to put it very crudely and simply, that spreads faster, or to use today's language, that goes viral in a way that a positive message doesn't, right? And I think it's not an easy kind of question to answer. We know that there is no one-to-one correlation between media and social effects. You can't say that you play a video game and you become violent. But on the other hand, we know that when you see the screaming on Indian television channels, what Arnab is doing, and so on, it absolutely has.
And Navika, we should be, we shouldn't forget Navika.
Oh yeah, yeah, like right up there, right? That's what's happened, right? Everyone is competing to be the next Arnab in some way for, eyeballs and so on. The question now becomes again about, what is the role and the responsibility of the text in all of this? Yes, the Gita press was militantly Hindu nationalistic, and it, starting in the 1920s, over a century, it's led to, I think, 70 million copies of the Gita being sold, right? And they publish the Gita, they don't change the content of the Gita, but if it is being published in a certain frame, if it's being seen as a text that advocates for Hindu nationalism, certainly that is part of the history of the Gita. A question for me always becomes, and I'll come to social media again, do we seed the space, right? Or do we try to make that text, frame that text, or have conversations about text, or do we challenge those readings and try and come up with a kind of countermeasure, right? That this is another way in which the text can be understood. And for me, the way to do that is to radically democratize access to it. Let's have criticism of the text, right? Let someone who's a Dalit scholar or an ordinary Dalit reader or a woman, let the interpretations that you mentioned, let people come up with a range of those kind of interpretations. So then what happens is that the kind of framing that the history of the Gita press represents is not so dominant. Now, there's another very interesting question here, which is about the question of responsibility is it the responsibility of civil society? Is it of the state? What kind of regulation do you have regarding the circulation of information in general, and especially information that could be potentially incendiary, right? So I know, for instance, that in the context of social media discussions, when you look at what's happened with the way in which Facebook has been used, WhatsApp has been used to foment violence in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in India, in Brazil, the answer of the tech platforms is basically that technology is a neutral platform. We are a third party. We can't be regulated like media firms. And, their belief is that just more speech is good speech. So people are being abusive or threatening each other or attacking minorities. Let more people speak and things will become okay. That self-regulation doesn't happen that way, right? And I think this is one of those cases where you really do need exactly that kind of thinking at the policy level about what possible consequences could there be. And I'll give you an example. In the Indian context, right, there was a policy, and a very good policy. I think I'm a child of the Doordarshan era. We got a small Uptron TV set after India won the 1983 World Cup. So I remember that, Doordarshan had a policy till they screened the Ramayana of not showing religious content. And I think that was a really, really good kind of policy. Now, you can't stop people from putting up, a quote from the Gita and then saying the vilest things. And you see this on Instagram and Twitter, right? Someone will say the entire world is one family, and then the guy is, a Hindu right-winger who's coming up with the most foul abuse, right? Or you will have someone who, will again maybe have a verse from the Quran, but they're expressing sentiments that are, that see people from other faiths as less. That you can't stop. But the fact that, these messages can be weaponized, or religion can be weaponized in this way, and it's one of the kinds of sort of sources that get weaponized. You can have other kinds of like non-religious sources or texts or ideas also being weaponized, like anti-vaxxer conspiracies. The left has its crackpot conspiracies, the right has them. So I actually think that state and the platforms really have to come together, and there has to be some minimal common understanding of the shared good and some thinking about technology.
The problem I see with that is, of course, that the state has an interest to have its own hegemonic needs of certain kinds of messages being privileged over others. And I think it's particularly challenging in this whole in the time of the pandemic, because, I think YouTube has just announced today that, they're going to take down every anti-vax video from the platform, which at one level as a temporary measure sounds great, but, science is never perfect. I'm not at all suggesting even for a moment, there's enough overwhelming evidence to show that vaccines are good, except in some cases of medical reasons for not having it. But, to completely crowd it out, then you end up making it look subterranean and give it a level of, power, and give it a seductive element to it, which makes it look greater. And that's the problem of banning things. I mean, that's one reason, that sunlight being the best disinfectant.
Yeah.
But when you mention this falsehood of moving very quickly, and people usually talk about the truth is tying its shoelaces while falsehood is 10 miles away. Actually, it's a very old quote. I just found out Jonathan Swift had said. So
Wow, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it. So I think that's exactly where we are, and that's where it boils down. That we are in a situation where it's very hard to create. And you said the freedom to speak is one thing, but freedom of reach is important, and freedom after speech is important. And I think where I think the more thinking needs to be done is what happens freedom after you speak. It's fine to say something on Facebook, but then after that, if the police are going to arrest you, what happened? And freedom of reach, what if you're shadow banned on Twitter? I mean, you had problems on Twitter. I've had a minor problem on Twitter too. And what do you do when that happened? And those are the kind of issues which, I mean, we're now going beyond the topic du jour, as it were, but I think they are related to it, and I think worth bearing in mind. So we are at whatever, we are at the 50th minute. And there are 6 questions, but before that, one final thought is before we turn to that, is that in this kind of a climate where there is so much weaponization of the message, and given the limitations that Gita has, both you talked about caste and the treatment and inclusion and diversity, that is your preferred mode. You read Gandhi, but only up to a point, and so why read it? Because your final answer is Gita sings to us in many voices, and we should listen to all of them. One of the specially important voices in which it sings is that of Gandhi. Tell me about that relevance today, because I think you also go into this wonderful example at the end of the book about the train, and how Gandhi was opposed to the idea of trains, and how your students are appalled, but you do see some logic in it. And if you can just elaborate on that before we turn to the audience.
So you all, read Gandhi like at your own peril, right? There's one article from a long time, I have an association with a book of Gandhi called Hind Swaraj, which is where he makes this point. And again, like generalize about Gandhi at your own risk. So there's one reading which says that in part it's kind of a retelling, or it's an engagement, or it draws on the Gita. But there's another argument which I think I'm also sort of persuaded by, which is, I think, was it you mentioned it about, I'm forgetting that Gandhi was actually responding to E.M. Foster, that he wrote Hind Swaraj when he was traveling on a ship, and there's some evidence to show almost certainly that there was a copy of Foster, and Foster's critique of technology was deeply kind of inspirational to Gandhi. So, but I think, regardless of whether the Gita is a direct inspiration for this particular book where he talks about technology, it certainly has a kind of like relevance, right? So there's 2 ideas out there. And the passage that Salil is referring to is that Gandhi in this book is critical of parliamentary democracy, which doesn't mean he's like, anti-democratic inherently in spirit, but he also like rejects Western science and technology. And he says that I'm opposed to the railways because what the railways do is that they make things too easy. Like people had to travel on pilgrimages to like, get karma. And now any rogue can just hop onto a train, and the railways, I mean, not once does you object to the railways on economic grounds of unemployment. The railways have spread disease. They're, carriers of, sort of all kinds of dangerous vectors and so on. And this puzzled my Indian students or Indian origin students when I taught this course called From Gandhi to Google, because they've been brought up to revere Gandhiji, and many of them wanted to be doctors and engineers and so on, right? And what Gandhi's doing is he's actually essentially part of what he's doing is he's rejecting any aspect that the British can claim kind of credit for: modernity, industrialization, and so on. But Gandhi's larger point is against what one calls an instrumentalization of technology, or again, going back to ends and means, right? That because this is a modern technology and this is a new technology and innovative, any outcome of it will necessarily be good, right? It's the kind of thinking that says that, uh, you know, once you know about splitting the atom, any consequence of that knowledge, that amazing scientific breakthrough, is going to be good. But one of the consequences of that was the nuclear bomb. So I think Gandhi's point essentially was that what it allows you to do also is it allows you to get credit for something, right? Or it allows you to act without being held accountable for that action. And to me, that is the resonance with what people do on social media, right? We think Facebook was this brilliant idea. We think Twitter is this brilliant idea, and maybe they are brilliant ideas, right? But that doesn't mean that because the inherent idea is interesting or a breakthrough, that every consequence of it is necessarily going to be true. So what Gandhi actually gives us is a critique of a certain kind of thinking about technology and industrialization and even about progress, and how it rests on what's called instrumental reason. So that to me is, very interesting. And I'll go in a slightly different direction. I've been thinking a lot about the term colonialism and colonization and how they're applied. And there's a fascinating passage where Gandhi lists in that book a set of conditions for the English. He says, if the English or the British, whatever, if they do this, if they're good, they give us equal rights. Or if they do not unjustly put people in jail, if they do not unjustly tax people, right? If they do not harass people, if they do not do this, right? If they do not exploit us, then I would say that India would actually be better off under them. And the genius of Gandhi there is what he's doing is all he's stating is all the claims that the British have made about being civilized. He's just holding them accountable. And he's saying, you do everything that you've said. This is what you've said. But his point is, this is what you said. You do 10, we don't want independence because we will have true Swarajya. But by doing it, he kind of calls out this hypocrisy. And I think, to me, that's the critique we need to make of technology. It's not about banning. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We can't go back to a pre-Facebook world. It's here. We have to live with it, like we have to live with the power of the Gita. But the question is that how do we, bring these forces or ideas, anything that has power, how do we bring it into a structure of accountability? And that to me is, I think, the brilliance of Gandhi.
Yeah, and no, that is a central challenge of our time, how to make power accountable. And usually that's what does not happen. And that's why we are in the mess in which we are. I'm going to turn to the questions. There are, one is about the translations itself. And, there's a question from N.R. Suparna, which is basically saying that Gita is not only a religious text, but unless you're conversant with Sanskrit, you can go wrong very badly because there are different meanings to words. And also, Suparna also goes on to ask that to interpret Gita in secular or Laukik terms without the spiritual underpinning, you could go astray. Is it possible for a Marxist or a Muslim or a Christian to interpret Gita without knowing Sanskrit, for example?
Oh, I think absolutely, right? But I don't think that we have to devalue one reading or claim that there's another reading. One of the books that I refer to, and I looked at about 15 editions in some depth, and I finally chose to work with a few. There are some that are actually, there's one by, I think, Stephen Mitchell. It's a poetic rendition, but he doesn't know Sanskrit. He's rewriting it in English from an English translation. I do not want to discount the value of knowing Sanskrit at all. And, one of the people I had a conversation with was Audrey Trushke, who's, also drawn the ire of the Hindu right for her book on Aurangzeb and so on, and her understanding of Mughal history. And she's she's a Sanskritist by training. And she teaches and has taught the Gita, and she, is familiar with the epithets. And we had a conversation about it. Ananya Vajpayee and Devasya Anthony, I had a conversation with them, and both of them are Sanskritists. So my reading is different from a philological reading, right? But I think if you follow the conventions of scholarship, or if you just follow the conventions of research, you don't have to be affiliated in a university. The text is available and accessible to everyone. You have, I had a wonderful conversation with the very good people at the Madras Management Association about, that's been one interesting thing about, just how many different groups are engaged or interested in this question. So the Madras Management Association, and the gentleman, Mr. JK, I'll call him, he knows some Sanskrit, and he really knows that verse very well. Absolutely. You can go wrong. Even, renowned scholars go wrong, right? Even great Sanskritists could go wrong. There's been debate between about, the translations that various scholars have used. And this happens all the time. So anyone can go wrong. And it's completely possible someone may actually come up with a particular reading and say that, here, this is why I think your reading is not tenable. So and absolutely, I think anything that you undertake, it's work that, you should do with humility, you should do with caution, you should do with rigor. So that point is very well taken. There have been some 1800 or so translations of the Gita. So I would say that because it's had this long life in translation already, it's a wonderful thing that, we can comment on it in that way as well. So that's what I would say, that the readings have different kinds of weight. Yeah.
And I would also think, I don't know Sanskrit, so I'll be the first to admit that. And it would be a very poor world if people can interact with a text only if they know that language. I don't know Spanish, but I'm so glad that somebody translated Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That's my point here. So I think, yes, it is always an enhanced experience if you have access to the language. But if not, we have to make do with less and thank God for translators. And that's wonderful. There's a question from Sankalp Chaudhary. Did the Gita survive or was it kept alive through Brahminical hegemony?
So this is a very interesting kind of question. And, in terms of how do you see the Gita's relationship to what may be called dominant ideology, or, Sankalp has used the term Gramscian hegemony. No question that, one of the histories or one of the forces that has kept the Gita alive is a certain kind of sort of link to power, right? But the dominance of the Gita has also been a relatively recent phenomenon. Its status as an text or ur text, how do you pronounce it? You are a text in Hinduism, so to speak, is a relatively recent phenomenon, last couple of 100 years, right? And that itself also has an interesting history. In the 18th and 19th century, it was the text that was really had seized the imagination of Europeans, right? And a number of European thinkers are also profoundly influenced by it. And this, coming back to, this is Amit Chaudhary's point. He thinks that the Kantian idea of distance, objectivity, which manifests itself in literary criticism as an objective act, actually comes from the Gita. And my speculative theory is that something of the idea that you can't control outcomes, which you see in economics and so on, may also come from here. So yes, that question of privilege is a question that has to be kept foregrounded. But does the idea of a text as the voice of a certain kind of hegemony exhaust that text? I don't necessarily buy that. I think that, yes, of course, there are some texts that are out and out propaganda, right? I don't think you could find, complexity in stuff that is absolutely, whether it's an anti-Semitic text like the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, or, a completely sort of horrendous racist poster, let's say, for instance. But its own history has been that it has been in some ways, a text that has crossed those boundaries of both malehood and Brahmanhood. And Laurie Patton, who's an Indologist and a Sanskritist, currently president of Middlebury College, she scholar of religion, she's done her own translation of the Gita, and she was on my dissertation committee. She talks about the different groups among whom this is circulated. Women will often refer to the Gita. Groups that are not dominant caste groups, the Gita has also made its way into their life. So I think you could make a reading, and that was Ambedkar's reading. He said it was like the Bible for the Hindus, and that perhaps is the way in which it was contextually, framed, and the way in which it was defended and protected. But in terms of the text itself, there is something in it that has also transcended those boundaries. And to me, that's where the value of the text comes from also.
A lot of what you just said kind of addresses the next question, but I think I'm going to ask it anyway if you want to add to that, because it's about the relevance. And This is from Praveen Ratan, who says that a large majority of the younger generation today don't know anything about the Gita, except by its name, that it's a Hindu text, or even from among students from the best of institutes. It's not discussed or taught in schools or colleges on grounds of going against secularism, nor is it being discussed at home. Then is reclaiming the Gita even relevant in today's context unless we begin relearning the Gita? So what do we do? I mean, First of all, I mean, yeah, I mean, is the whole debate, I mean, that's being played out in the national sphere and in the domestic sphere. Yeah.
In the Indian context, it's a very tricky question about how are you going to implement this, right? How are you going to get a bunch of kids to talk critically about different religious texts? I still think, there's a right time for doing it. I do think, for instance, that the more texts we talk about of all kinds, right, the better it is for society. And the more open we are to criticizing those texts, and the better it is and the healthier it is for society. And I don't think we should seek to use the text as the final word on anything. I don't think we should see it in a hagiographic way, but we really should democratize access to it in every way. And this too is part of, who we are. And I don't want to say that you should see this text as being special in the Indian firmament for any reason. But the reason I keep coming back to saying that, we need to engage with these texts is that, as I say, they're already part of our reality. Now, I'm not doing that thing here saying that, there's sort of a Hindu ethos in the air everywhere in India, and what to Hindu hi hai, and I'm not going down that line at all. But you spoke about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and one of the arguments that in the human rights world is that for your average person, even in the US, I mean, what purchase does the you do if you say that this is a principle enshrined by the Declaration of Human Rights? What affective, emotional charge does that have, right? But to understand a situation, to navigate a situation, people will draw on the Quran or the Bible, or, on a religious parable that a family member may have told them, or from the Gita, right? Just casually, if people say, Karam karo, lekin, phal ki chinta mat karo. And you're like, look, your whole life is devoted towards phal, right? Get the good job, clear this exam and so on. So it's already there. Let's start a conversation. How is it going to happen in India if we're under fear, if there's section 153, 295? It's a complicated question. I don't claim to have the answer to it. But I think what we need is also a larger kind of transformation, right? Where we need to think about sort of censorship and law and sedition and all of that. I just take a second more. My reaction always used to be, like, still is often, colonial era laws, let's do away with them. And then, Jyoti Punwani, who's an activist and journalist and has written on rights, she had made a very interesting point. She said that these are the only laws that also double, in a sense, as hate speech laws, which is not to say that the laws are wonderful. They're not. But the point is, it speaks to an absence of other kinds of issues, right? And we know that the weaponization of religion, the fact that religious riots are not spontaneous, they are planned, that they get political capital for various people, we get into a larger question of politics in society. But to me, sometimes it seems almost that, people, we often assume in a certain kind of limited thinking that we are on this road and this is, or rail track, and this is where Gandhi comes in, that, we are better now than things were 40 years ago. And in many respects, they are. We had the internet. I remember living in Calcutta where we had 8 hours of electricity cuts or load shedding a day. So life is much better. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have become more free or tolerant or inclusive. It seems that in some ways, in earlier India, which I don't want to romanticize, you could be much more critical about these texts. It seems at times in the 19th century, the Hindu reform movements were much, much more critical about aspects of Hinduism than we are today. So I'll quote something which I've been quoting again from my teacher, that every orthodoxy started out as a heresy. Not every heresy becomes an orthodoxy, but every orthodoxy started out as an heresy. So it may seem heretical that we talk about religion in this way, but why not?
No, absolutely. And I mean, Jyoti has a fair point about the hate speech laws, but that takes us down the dangerous path of what is hate speech. Is it hate speech or the speech that you hate and therefore you call it hate speech? So it becomes hate speech. And that's the problem here, that the contextual and definitional issues. And you're absolutely right about even about the pre-independence era, what Modern Review published at that time, the magazine, and Nilanjana, Devanshu, and Abhirup, they had published a compendium which was basically collecting the essays that came out of it. And when you read that, and when you read that the current context, you wonder whether some of those pieces could appear easily in contemporary India, and that's something worth bearing in mind. There's a question from Som Thomas here, that the story of the killing of Duryodhana is used to justify violence against various constructions of other. How best can such interpretations be responded to?
It's right, come up with an interpretation from the perspective of those who are villainized in the text, right? And you can do that kind of reading, and you can do that kind of reading in different ways. You can do that kind of reading through what you understand of historical context, or you can look at it completely in the context of just looking at the text as a closed system, right? I'm also, like, by training, by background, a literature scholar, and then I did a PhD on internet communities and the sociology of internet use, and I went into history and interdisciplinary analyses and so on. But if you look at the text just in and of itself, and you look at characters in the text, and you look at that dialectic, you can basically come up with that interpretation, right? What is it from Duryodhan's point of view, right? And it's very interesting that from a caste perspective, certainly you could write, there's so much that still has to be written and can be written about the Mahabharata. The R.K. Narayan, the edition of the Mahabharata, it's a very slim one, and it's in that retelling. There is a particular passage where the Pandavas, what they do is they let it be thought that two of them or three of them are in a particular residence dwelling, so that the Kauravas arrange to set fire to it. But actually, the people who are in there is someone who is from a Nishada community, which is an indigenous community, right? And the introduction to the text by Wendy Doniger says that in some ways Narayan was, so embarrassed by this fact almost that he excised it from his telling. And for me, there is a way in which, there's a very interesting way in which we can read the story of Eklavya, for instance, and as a parable about what I call disabling, that he's literally disabled. But to disable someone, and I'm developing this in another book, is also to reduce their capacity to, for instance, be able to excel or to do something else. And that act of getting him to cut his own thumb is, the violence of that is manifold, because it's a physical act of violence, but there's another dimension of violence that you're asking him to do it himself, right? And it also symbolically represents the fact that you're crippling someone's possibilities for life. And isn't that what caste prejudice does?
And precisely in the one area where he has shown excellence, it's not like cut
there
off
we
a
go.
toe. Yeah, it's exactly where he had shown that he was superior to Arjuna.
Yeah, and this is what, if you look at so much of caste violence is about humiliation. It's about knowing your place, right? At this conference that I was like part of, Meena Kandaswamy, she spoke about, she said, she is a very good point. We're going a little further away, but I'll just take a minute, that she criticized a certain kind of wokeness for really being politically very regressive, where you have, people saying that a Dalit man's mustache, that big, powerful mooch is like toxic masculinity. She says, no, it's not. It's just a mustache. And she said, in the context of caste relations in India, where Dalit men are actually murdered for the alleged temerity of, having a mustache, that is a politically important act.
Yeah, absolutely. Who has the power, and where does the power lies, and how it is used? That's what it is about. We have two more questions here. One is from Chandramohan Venugopal, that the discussion appears to be exploring the negativity in the Gita. There is no attempt to explore the positivity in the Gita. Why is there no talk about the connection between Gita and modern physics and cosmology? Can any lessons be drawn towards improving politics and technology from the Gita?
All right, the quick answer to the first one is no, in my view, right? I don't. I mean, I know there's been there is a lot of talk about how in Indian texts, in Hindu texts, and the two are not necessarily the same, of course, that there is, and ancient Indian texts did make very significant contributions to aspects of science. We know Sushruta has some writings about, a nose graft, a nose skin graft, and so on. But the idea that the secrets of nuclear physics were there in our ancient texts, I just personally I'm not persuaded by. But the whole book is a positive book in a sense. So I'm not, I'm saying that the message is relevant, but that we have to apply it with caution, and we have to think about how we apply it. And to me, it is a source of ethical, fecundity. Now, absolutely, that's what Salil and I were discussing with regard to the last chapter, that I think, to me, the interesting thing, one of the sort of powerful principles is the idea of what I call epistemic humility, right? Which comes back to the Nishkama Karma Yoga, which is that you don't know what the outcomes would be. So if we have that humility, with regard to a political discussion, ethical discussion, the use of technology, I think it will, it will serve us all. And then the second point, to me, one of the most positive things is Arjuna's anguish. And again, that doesn't mean that Arjuna can't be critiqued, that the doubt that he faces, he doesn't want to go to war with his kin. For Gandhi, this was a shortcoming because he said Arjuna only wants to practice non-violence against his, and I thank the person, I forget who told me about this, that he only wants, he's not committed to non-violence against people who are not from his kull or his kin, right? But I'm saying we can take that message, right, in modern everyday life, and we can think, who are our kin? Is it only people in my nation? Is it only people in my religion, right? And we can take it beyond an anthropocentric perspective, that what obligation do we have to our fellow species, right? Especially with regard to like climate change and so on. So thank you. It's a very good question. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's what Pramodya Anantatur, the Indonesian writer, the child of all nations. We are all children of each nation, and we are all from Africa. It all goes back to that. That's the whole idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right? I mean,
absolutely.
In which case, it can be taken to that extreme. The last question, which kind of is a good way for you to sum up what you sure. have been saying, which from S.M. what are the lessons we can derive from Gita viewed as philosophy and literature? And it's interesting, the two choice of term, the Prasad hasn't used the word religion. So let's look at it from philosophy and literature. What are the lessons you draw from that?
Well, it's, in a literary sense, again, I'll go back to Amit Chaudhary. Amit basically has a very interesting point where he says that he sees the text as a response in the philosophical tradition, in the Hindu philosophical tradition, to threats from, Buddhism, for instance, the dominance of Buddhist thought and so on. And he basically says that, and I think I'm getting this right, and he basically says that what happens is that it's a philosophical restatement, but it is using the power of poetry. Like it goes to the poetic register, right? Now, there's another whole debate in literary and philosophical and aesthetic studies that we can get into, which is that what happens when you aestheticize the political? Can art be a response to politics, right? So that's one point. Now, as a philosophical text, absolutely. So this text can also be understood as a kind of debate in a long and rich philosophical tradition. That's not my training. I didn't go there because, I didn't want to risk making a fool of myself in one more area potentially. So trained philosophical philosophers will have that conversation. And, one of the interlocutors I had a conversation with, Professor Devasya Anthony of Hindu College, actually mentioned this, where he said that one of the way of understanding, like, how do you separate desire, like the desire to, how do you separate yourself from the desire to control outcomes? And he says that it's an aspirational ideal. You can try to be detached in the knowledge that you may not be able to, right? So that's one very small example of how we can understand it as a philosophical text. But I think the thing to do is go to the text, claim it as your own, see how these ideas apply, right? See if you can find solace in them. And I think, we can or we can find value, and then some ideas may not work, but that's what keeps a tradition alive. Literary, even in translation, it's an exquisite text, and each translation has its own merit. And this is why I think that we need to not shy away from like religious texts which are marked as religious, because they are also texts that have, a general or secularized spiritual value and a philosophical value and an aesthetic value. I'll take 1 second. One of the translations, again, Laurie Patton's, they're just these passages where every time Krishna addresses Arjuna, he talks about his hair. Oh, lustrous haired one. Oh, thick haired one. Oh, beautiful haired one. And I always wondered that if I met Arjuna, and I want to know what shampoo he uses. And because it's just, there's something there. And Audrey Trushke said, this is a big debate among us, among Indologists and Sanskritists and those who translate. This Sanskrit is full of epithets. What do you do with the epithets, right? So Barbara Stoller Miller's edition, which is a very sort of spare and beautiful edition, and one of my favorites, which I've used in the book a good bit, doesn't have the epithets. But yeah, absolutely. It's a marvelous text in all kinds of ways. Like, I am death, I have become the destroyer of worlds. I mean, there are passages that are even in like translation, it's a good translation, I shouldn't say even in translation, just immensely, immensely moving.
Thank you. And yes, I've always seen, literature also is taken to levels of divinity. You started by talking about Star Wars, and you know how people get worked up about Star Wars. You could say the same about J.R.R. Tolkien, you know, and the universe that he creates, and how people look at Lord of the Rings as some kind of a parable of our times and look at it. So I think I do hear you, and I do think there's a lot that you said about the whole philosophical part and the literary part. It does offer guidance to people, but what kind of guidance it gives people always varies. Some people may end up entrenching the hierarchies that exist and continue to keep the world in the state it is in by saying that this is a divine ordained meaning, and others will see it as a limitation that imposes, and the fact that, you know, we have to act regardless of knowing what the consequences are, because those consequences will happen. So fascinating, and you know, I'm intrigued about the next book you will be writing, and thanks a lot for your time, and all the best with everything you do.
Thank you very much, Salil. Thanks to BIC, thanks to Westland also, really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone who made the time. Okay, take care. Bye.
What one takes away from this conversation is that readings and interpretations of texts such as these cannot happen in isolation, either of the mind or physically or that of ideology. Conversations like these, where minds meet to speak on equal terms, are really the lifeblood of larger cultural and civil discourse. Thank you for taking us on a journey ranging from Kant to Ramanujan to Gandhi, Brecht, Lucas, Heidegger, Kadaswamy, Trushka, and even Zuckerberg, and rooting it all to the Gita. To rephrase Carnad, the Mahabharata is always our latest war. And I think by extension, the Gita is always around the corner in all our conversations. Thank you, Salil, for your time and for being as terrific as always. Thank you, Rohit, for the book, which we will all head to the bookstores to pick up, I'm sure. And all I have to say now is good night, and see you all next time.
Bye.